Hello, friends. Welcome to this episode of Textual Community, a podcast that explores the task of reading biblical texts in light of the canonical collection and within a confessional community. In this episode, I talk with Dr. Christopher Seitz about his wonderful new little book on the theme of creation in the Psalter and in the book of Job. The book is titled The Heights of the Hills Are His Also, from Baylor University Press, and I have a link to order it in the show notes if you're interested, and I think you should be. At any rate, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being here and welcome. We're going to talk about your newest work, The Heights of the Hills Are His Also. So in some ways, this is a very different kind of writing than you've done in the past. So maybe we'd start thinking about what are some of the reasons or motivations that led you to write a volume like this?
Yeah, thank you, Ched. And I do have, you kindly sent me some questions to reflect on. And in response to the first one, it seems to me there are two ways of answering the question. One of them has to do with why the book is different in character than a lot of the books that I have written over the course of my career. That's one kind of question. And then there's another question, why this particular topic on Job and Psalms. On the first one, in some ways, this is a very different kind of writing, is the way you put it. And it is. And I've thought a little bit about that. It is a different kind of writing. I've written a lot of books, and I have written academic books in various genre, commentaries, monographs, introductory works. And I think over the course of a career, those genre of books are familiar. And one is, I think, typically trying to show that they're familiar with the field. And in my case, also, I've had an interest in pushing the field or reshaping the way questions are raised coming out of the context of historical critical investigation. And so the books are for the field in a sense, as well as for an audience of readers. And also in my case, a lot of my career has been training PhD students, and I have felt it necessary to keep my name in print in front of the public so and I can hopefully attract them. A lot of people teaching don't have the luxury or the reality of having to work with PhD students. But in my case, I've done a lot of that over the course of my life. And so the genre of writing is fairly self-evident. Dave Nelson, who's the editor at Baylor, felt as though I was changing my style with Elder Testament and convergences a bit. And I think that that's probably right, though this is a step out beyond that. I mean, one way I think about it is also, well, why do we have the genre of books that we do have? I have a great interest in the so-called pre-critical interpretation of Scripture, where the modern genre is not present. And so you see a very different kind of writing on the Bible, erudite in its own way, but certainly not of chief interest, contributing to an academic discourse in some ways. And I suppose that's one factor that goes into what I was doing. I also was copy editing, or I agreed to read through a novel about France from a friend of mine. And in the context of doing that, I tapped into the fact that for stretches of my life, I have wanted to write novels, and actually wrote a novel when I was in New Haven, and never did anything with it. So that kind of writing is something that comes naturally to me. I think the readers of this book will notice that it's not something I'm trying out for the first time, but something that is deep within me. And I suspect I feel as though at this point in my career, I'm entitled, I don't think that's the right word, free to do some anecdotal writing. And when I was living in France, I had to spend a lot of time inside the French language. And one of the things that when you get to a certain point and you're working on your French, one of the things you're doing is actually just telling stories. You're not working your way through textbooks any longer. And so then the question arises, well, why do you talk about what you talk about? And I found myself talking about my upbringing, in particular my experience of going to this boarding school, which I talk about in the book, which over the course of my life now is still very fresh in my mind, as are the sailing stories and things in the book. And that I'm aware of how much the world has changed, that the kind of tasks and chores and rhythms of clearing stumps and clearing clinkers out of furnaces, or fighting a headwind coming down the Atlantic seacoast, these things kept me very close to the created realm. And that's something I'm trying to deal with in this book. And I had agreed or volunteered or proposed to lead morning prayer worship in the little community here in the United States where I live. And upon doing that, and I had grown up, I say this in the book, I had grown up with these rhythms of morning prayer services that were full of canticles. And canticles take the form chiefly of praising God in creation. And they can take the form of praising his mighty acts. But the two that are most central to morning prayer worship, the Jubilate Deo and the Venite, are hymns to God, praising him for being the maker of heaven and earth, as the creed puts it, even the basic Apostles' Creed. And so the line for the title of the book, his hands prepared the dry land, the sea is his, and the sea is his, and he made it, and his hands prepared the dry land. The heights of the hills are his also, and so forth. In the context of worshiping alongside other people who don't have the familiarity with these services, this kind of sticks out. I think it's a good thing that we move to Eucharistic worship on Sundays typically, but one of the things that falls out is this dimension of praising God for his control over the created order. And so I thought I would try to write something up about that. As for the second part of the first question, why this material? I've been interested in Job for a while, and I've lectured on it quite often. When I interviewed at Yale in 1987, I wrote a paper. It was published in Interpretation called Job: Full Structure, Movement, and Interpretation. And when I lecture on Job, I have, I assign that. And I was trying to break away from reading the book through theories about its composition and theories about the author's location, and felt I had succeeded in doing that. It was interesting because Childs was on the faculty then, and I've said this to others. When he taught graduate seminars, he didn't talk about his own work. He tried to teach us to think about critical methods that he himself saw some fruitfulness in, but had moved beyond. And so he wanted to be sure we knew that context. And I had only read the introduction to the Old Testament as scripture just before that, because I was teaching and I was using it for the first time.
Mhm.
And there were things that I felt the canonical reading highlighted that fell out in any developmental model. I think chiefly the distinction between what the reader knows and what Job knows. For example, Job doesn't know why God is testing him, and he, in some measure, he can't know, because if he knew, his responses to God would be in response to a dilemma rather than in response to him personally. And Satan has said that no one will serve God for his own sake. They'll only do it if there is a, as it were, sort of quid pro quo. And so, reading the book with an eye toward that, and rejecting the idea that the so-called dialogues are static and go nowhere, was something I was already working at, and that the friends begin to fizzle out. Job, arises. So those were things in my mind. Also, the four lectures, the four small print sections of Barth on the true witness, had made an enormous impact on me. I think it's the best writing that Barth does. I mean, in general, I think the small print, the exegetical Barth, is far richer than the dogmatics themselves. That's just my view as an exegete. And I've said as much. I think a good book would be to collect a lot of those sections and simply print them up. But I found that when I was lecturing on Job, the material was so close to me that I would ask permission of whatever audience I was talking to, that I wouldn't give lectures on Job unless they gave me permission to just simply read long sections of Barth aloud, because they're quite powerful, and it's hard to just talk about them. You need to let Barth talk. He's at this point, he's preaching. He's got the other side of him up and running. And that also figures into this. I'm a preacher. I get asked to preach a lot. And preaching is something I work hard at. And my late wife always asked me to try to write more in the vein that I'm writing in this book. So I made a commitment to not include any footnotes and so forth, and to try to, I was asked to situate the book in the history of scholarly ideas, which I do in the beginning, but that hadn't even been my instinct. I know the territory well. And that brings me to the Psalms, because reading the Psalms in their canonical shape and design, Gerald Wilson, the student of Childs, before I was his student, had begun to work along these lines. I disagreed with him about how he handled Book 5 of the Psalter, but in general, the idea that the Psalter is meaningfully arranged loosely is also a good way to put it. It's not some sort of a heavily left brain organizational structure, but there is structure all the same, and the structure does track, I think, fairly clearly with the figure of David, the figure of the monarchy, more largely comprehended, and the fact that the covenants to which the Psalms can on occasion make reference to in Psalm 89 appear to have been broken. Psalm 89's genius in it kind of reminds God of how great it was he made promises to David, only to set it up as, then why have you broken these promises? And because I was interested in creation, I began to look a little more closely at their distribution and how they function across this 5-book structure. And I was struck that in Book 4, which is really where the wheels come off, Israel, it seems to me, is being asked to, one, review their history. God was faithful, and therefore he can be faithful again. One can also review one's own mistakes with God and have them brought to light so one may penitentially reflect on them. The other thing that arises is simply these long psalms that praise God as creator. And for those of us who were raised in typical historical critical reading, there's a lot of emphasis on the saving acts of God, but not as much on the force of God as creator. So I wanted to look a little bit more closely at that. There is, after all, a covenant with creation, so when the covenants fall down and Israel's lost, they aren't lost entirely because God has made the seas and filled them and regulated them and makes the sun to come up every morning and so forth and so on. So, and that's one of the things I reflect on in here, and I do it through the lens, anecdotally, of my experience with limitation in creation, sometimes quite harrowing at sea or in the context of hard labor and other things. And I enjoyed being able to reflect on that and to work it in alongside. And I think in general, I'm trying to find a way to break out of some patterns of writing that, by useful illustration, not unlike what happens in sermons, one can shed a kind of a better light on the history, on interpreting a book. And the canonical reading is familiar to me already, so this gave me an opportunity. And and the thing that this comes up as well, and you'll know it, that because the category of wisdom literature had tended to move Job in a medial position on a track of pessimism from Proverbs to Ecclesiastes, it constrained the way we thought about it in ways that I felt were quite unhelpful. And there is a push now, as you may know, Catherine Dell, Will Kynes, and others, to bust up the wisdom category. And I'm all in favor of that. I'm not as persuaded about where they want to go, but it does lead Job to be a big book. I think that's the best way to say it. And in canonical lists, it's next to the Psalter. The obvious thing that any reader would see would be the Psalms of Lament and their density in the Psalms, and Job's also laments. But I was interested not so much in that. That's well-worn territory, and more in why it is that when God decides to speak, he allows creation to talk for him. And a typical way of handling this in the developmental model is to say it's not satisfying, puzzling, or something. And I refuse to go down that lane because I take seriously Job's announcement that he has been lifted onto another plane of comprehension with God, for which the language, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, now my eye sees you. And as the one thing that I really felt has been misunderstood is that Job is not an Israelite. He is a man from the East, and that the book has chosen a figure that we know from Ezekiel and other places is thought to be the colleague, the contemporary of Noah, and that rather than ignoring that, to let it come full center as the artist's license, the inspired writer's license, to deal with a person out of a certain context, close to creation, is one way of putting it, and also without recourse to a sacred history. That Job can't say, that doesn't show up in the book, that we don't have any of that. The only sacred history Job knows is his own, in which he poignantly tells us about before Elihu strides on the field, and that's a personal history of sanctity and holiness and exemplary behavior that he's proud of, and that God is proud of as well, and therefore he's allowing Satan to challenge this beloved particular person because God believes in him and trusts him. And he, as it were, he has to wager on Job himself, and so forth. So I don't get that. I don't get those notes when I read about Job typically. And I've lectured on the book a lot. And when I lost my wife, as you may know, to COVID, and I have had to think a lot about what it means to go into a place where God, this I picked up from Bard. Unsurprisingly, he's a Lutheran, Reformed Lutheran, Lutheran Reformed. The idea that God is familiar to us until he chooses to be foreign to us. And that Jesus Christ himself experiences the total foreignness of God as part of who God is and his sovereignty. He it is who rules the wind and waves, has unto himself a transcendence and a power that is not like anything else. And the cultural problem I was also pushing at is I think we've lost a sense of this. We may come to this at the end, but as I'm thinking about it, I can't remember which adventure where Abraham's passing his wife off as his sister. And one of them, I think it's the second one, he says, I did it because there was no fear of God in the land. And it can come to a place where there is no fear of God. There is no sense of his ownership of all that is here. You get people interested in ecology, but never, well, I shouldn't say never, but without a whole lot of attention to the fact that it's God's world that we're concerned about here, not just the world. But once we start thinking that way, then we've moved into a different place. And the cyber thing, has a kind of, it giveth and it taketh away. And I think the problem is particularly acute in the United States because we really are the champions of the development of this thinking, this technology, where the past recedes rapidly behind us. And we are invested in the idea that we will invent or discover things that are still in front of us in time, that are necessary, as it were, to make sense of our world. And that isn't the way people have typically thought about time and the world. I mean, I spent a lot of time in France, and they have a phrase, FAGO, Facebook, Amazon, Google, Apple. And that for them that's what Americans do, There's nothing wrong with that. But if you're only ever saying my iPhone 12 is en route to iPhone 13, 14, 15, and you begin throwing statues in the water and that kind of thing, you've lost your grip on God's providential life, which is a scarred and messy life. That people made mistakes, but that's history. That's time. That's those are things that we lose at our peril, and we become unmoored. You got a guy who just creates a ghost gun. What in the world is a ghost gun? He creates one, and he mows down a person he doesn't know. And what do we find out he's been doing? He's been playing games, and so the man was a parasite. He's robbed of all his humanity. Let's leave aside you asked something about culture. Well, how is this happening? Or far more controversial, but to my mind, totally unacceptable development. The idea that you alter people's actual corporal givenness, their bodies. Where are we here? Leaving aside that no one could have done this even 50 years ago because we lacked the technology to do it. It's kind of, in this book, I don't deal with any of that. I deal with what I believe to be the beauty and raw power of God's control over things. And I just want to lift that up. I mean, one way I say it, so I'm from Western North Carolina originally. We have terrible floods. People are living in shacks, and it's horrible. They've lost everything. Well, we think of that as an aberration, and thank goodness it is. It's an interruption of a brokenness. But in reality, most people thought of life as like this all the time, and they thanked God for to quote the prayer book, we thank you for our creation, preservation, and all the blessings of this life. And so it's that dimension I was trying to find, that I worry, and I miss it myself. And I'm glad we have canticles that help remind us, and psalms that help remind us of this.
Well, that speaks to the power of the shape of a biblical book and the way that it unfolds, bringing you as a reader on a journey through confusion and the abstraction of thinking theologically about who God is and what he's doing, down to as we're describing, the embodied nature of life, where we're working through these things, and the effect of that as a reader, giving us a different mode of thinking or horizon of thought about the world itself. Well, you touched on this a few minutes ago, but I wanted to come back to that and to kind of circle back to kind of what we've been talking about in the opening. In one sense, the heights of the hills are also his is different than some of your other work, but in another sense, that, as we've already been talking about, it is distinctive, but it also deeply resonates with your overall approach to reading the scriptures canonically. So you've already kind of illustrated the way that a canonical reading allows you to see some patterns or associative links or thematic threads between the Psalms and Job that you might not have seen if you were working within a historical critical paradigm or wisdom lit construct. Something you said in the Goodly Fellowship that really stuck out to me when I first read it is that the idea that order and association precede lists. So when you find a text in lists that have been put together, there's already something ordering and a series of associations that are present, and that there's always associations created by a new construct or a reconstructed genre or a Sitzenleben, however it's construed. But one aspect of the canonical approach that you've kind of worked through is that we need to recognize that in these scenarios, there's already a web of association within the final form of a book that's been brought together in a canonical grouping, perhaps, that is muted when the book is moved into a new set of associations. So the effect of allowing Job to speak on its own terms, and then, as you've talked about, it's a towering voice, whereas it might be muted in a different way. And so I thought, for me, the lament and the Psalms of Lament and Job were an obvious one that you mentioned, but one of the things that you focused on here was the connection between the final avalanche of hallelujahs in book 5 of the Psalms and the God speaking out of the whirlwind. So in one sense, the Psalms helped me understand Job, but the way that you were bringing Job into dialogue with the Psalms, that was one of my favorite connections that you made, thinking about what is the effect of the juxtaposition for me as a reader, like gaining new insight, where you see um, it's what you're talking about before. It's like one understanding of the end of Job is the Lord descending into Job's frame of reference. But what you were emphasizing was that rather it's a pulling of Job up into God's eye view of, so if you want to, you weren't here when I laid the foundations of the earth, so let me give you a glimpse of that vantage point. And so that helped me as you make a few connections to the end of the Psalter where it helps explain what is the Psalter doing at the end when it's almost as if the psalmist is unable to gather his own words anymore because of the character of God in Psalm 145. He can't. He's given up all of his words and recognizes that it is such a lofty task to praise God. He then summons the creation to bring forth the praise because he's reached the end of his linguistic abilities. So I just thought about that it reminded me of the method discussion here. It's like I I mean I saw it because you laid it out so well for me in the chapters, but it's a result of allowing Job to speak with a discrete voice and then in dialogue with the end of the Psalter, which I might not have seen if I hadn't brought those two into dialogue with one another, through considering your work. So one of the things that struck me about this work is that you're really pushing into the implications of some of those prior interpretive decisions that I saw, like in convergences. You're talking about the convergence of an American scholar like Childs and Beauchamp in France, but also the convergences of the final form or the convergences of the liturgy and the lived embodied life of the churches. So that's something that really struck me about how your prior approach to the scriptures in reading is going to have an effect on the way that you think that dialogue is occurring. I found that really striking.
Thank you. And um, you've said what I would want to say. I think I like the way you handled the end of the Psalter, that there's a kind of glossolalia. The psalmist has run out of language, and so is now being given it as it were. What is he being? He's being given to see creation praising God, and there we have good Christian wisdom down the ages to which one could have recourse about just this fact. In the case of Job, I think the thing that I didn't feel was sufficiently represented in what I have read on the book, and I have, like anybody else, I've read a lot, is Job is demanding that God appear to him. And what God does is he says, I'm going to tell you about the things that pertain to me, that only pertain to me, because those are the things that most make me who I am. And they're the most personal things that can be said about me. They're not on analogy, they're not metaphors. They are the things that you want me to be me. You want me to enter into a discussion with you. I can do that, but I can't do it in the form of explanation. I can't do it in the form of pathos. I'm not going to, or I choose not to. I'm doing it in the form that most truly is representative of who I am. And Job is transformed. Now, we may struggle to understand how that's going on, but he's not struggling with it. He knows exactly what's happening. I put my hand over my mouth. And God says, I'm coming at you again. Okay. And Bart is right here, I think, that God has to wager. I mean, in a way, he says, in a memorable phrases, Job could have done nothing more than gape at the book of nature. He could have beat the air. He could have said, this is all well and good, but I am not persuaded. And God trusted that Job would hear him and see him in the form that he is, because he was this man that God loved and trusted. And in so doing, Job is transformed. And then I think the insight that I was working with, as it turns out, I think Bart had it too, although I hadn't read his work when I first worked on Job in the 80s, was that in order to know when a book is over, because what you're talking about in both cases is we're being taken on a journey. And life is a journey. Life is a narrative. And our lives are like the journey of the psalmist, that our lives are like unto Job's. Job is particular, but we can learn from particular people. That's why they're saints. And so that both works bespeak a narrativity that isn't highly constrained, but nevertheless helps us flow along. We got a lot of David, then we got a lot of monarchy, then we got no monarchy or no David, then we got the sacred history, then we got creation, and then we got endless hallelujah. And that marks a trail that all of our lives are like. Everyone's life will come to a point where God will not be familiar, and where his voice is dim. And those are the most important episodes, because they're asking us to hear how he talks. I mean, all good books on prayer talk about this, that it's in praying and lamenting and so forth that we get changed. So we have to lift our voices in order for him to lift his to us in a different way. That's not like the typical way we listen or hear words. It's the Spirit's activity. And in the case of Job, the thing that had struck me was, in order to know when a book is resolved, you have to ask what the problem was. Any good story has a denouement, an unknotting of something. What was the knot? The knot was, no mortal will serve God for naught. As it turns out, it rhymes, but you get the point. And so we only know when Job has resolved the knot, has untied the knot, when, okay, he's on his way, he's heard God talk, he acknowledges that he's been lifted in a place where the familiar and the unfamiliar are being resolved for him in the very godness of God. And then, out of earshot, he tells Job, the friends come, and he says, my wrath is upon you, and you will go to Job, and he will pray for you, and you make sacrifices and so forth. Job knows nothing of this. They come to him. Now, that must have been an interesting scene. Here the guys have been hounding him forever and ever, and offering theology and offering, and actually, I say this in the book, the field of battle on which Job is fighting is superheated by the context in which it's happening, so that they're the ones who are talking about God and him, and therefore he stays with that topic. Now, one thing I had never seen before, and Bart points this out, was we all expect Job to complain about the concrete realities. I lost my kids, I lost all my possessions. Not a word. It's not really. That's not the matter he's concerned about. He's concerned about the loss of God. That's what's bothering him. And only in the chapter where he reminisces do we learn about who he was, his righteousness wrapped around his head like a turban. Bart calls it his adamantine certainty of who he was, now gone. And so how do we know when the book is resolved? It's when Job becomes the man he was on the ash heap. On the ash heap, he becomes the man who he was before, a man of prayer who got up every morning and prayed for his sons lest they sin. So by praying, by being the man he was before, still with all of the assault of God upon him, he defeats Satan. And that's the end of the book. And we hear no more from that man. He's gone, or that character. And God restored the fortunes of Job when he prayed for his friends. And there you begin to see all the rich Christological, figural reality of Job. Job isn't saving the sins of the world, but he is a type of Christ who plumbs the depths of sin and suffering and prays for his friends and is restored because of that. And as Bart would say, he's a type of the true witness. But I think it's the point of contact for me was, my goal was to try to understand the divine speeches that are in the same category, as it were, as the Psalms of creation, the difference being that here we're having God talk about it himself. This isn't praise rising up from us. That's got its definite important place. This is God saying, look here, let's start looking around here. Let me show you animals that actually aren't even they're not in your little handbook on animals. They're these creatures that live way out someplace whose patterns are not knowable. That's who I am. I made those things. You get a similar thing in the structure of Ecclesiastes, where the first half of the book, the man is having to adjust his vision to exceptions to the rules, and he doesn't, is a crooked branch that can't be straightened a bad thing, or is it a reality? You try to straighten a crooked branch, you break it. It belongs to the wisdom of the way God's world is, that we have to get used to the exceptions to the rules. And then the second half of the book is just a lot of who knows. And you have to hear that right. You can't hear this as pessimism or cynicism. Every generation that read Ecclesiastes, really until modernity, thought it was it was right there on the center of their bookcase, along with a skull. Remember, this is where we're. Our days are numbered, and we have a God who created us, and So there is a similar kind of thing. I think in the case of the Psalter, it's trying to take seriously what happens when darkness descends, and not blink from that as though that's an episode in life that's best to turn away from. Obviously, the most brilliant thing about the Psalter is that it's unvarnished. It doesn't. Any book of spiritual discipline the first thing they're going to have to talk about is being honest with God and believing that God takes account of every single thing, and that he delights to have conversations with us. He can't wait. And he doesn't want us to put things in categories. I don't talk to God about that. When I'm done getting that sorted out, I'll have a word with God. No. And we all operate this way. My son got a sprained ankle, and I've got to take him to the soccer match, and he cried this morning. Yeah, but God, that he can't be bothered with these kinds of things. He'll get over it, and then we'll have a chat with God. No, that God cares most about those things. Those are the things he most cares about. And the Psalter just tells us this, and so he takes us on this journey.
One of the things you have that was really striking about the Psalter that you bring out, Job and Ecclesiastes, as you mentioned. First, the middle of those books, and there's discrete parts of those books framed by the compositional canonical shape of the book itself, generates a dynamic that is necessary for the book to do its work. If you Sometimes there's a rush to disconnect those to resolve the tension when that dynamic is part of the way that the book is designed and given to function. And then one of the effects of that is striking in the biblical text, but I feel like you're doing it as well in this book, is this climbing up and down the ladder of abstraction. So in one sense, there's these lofty, transcendent thoughts, and then juxtaposed right next to that is something about the nitty gritty nature of, as you said a second ago, like a tree branching or a branch breaking, or the shape of a tree, or the path of an insect, as a means of telling you something about transcendence. So in one sense, you can look up to the heavens, look down to the deeps, or just the details of, a human being or social situation. So thinking about Psalm 104 in relationship to the soaring doxology of the Psalter, or some of the nitty gritty of Job's speech, or Ecclesiastes meandering, and then the kind of soaring expressions at the beginning and end of those books. You kind of work through that as you're articulating the vision of the Psalter, but also what it's like to hold on to a rope as a sea, as a wall of water is approaching you. Both of those things are going on. You see a sea of water in the vastness of the terror of creation, but also feeling the your bones tension and the your muscles tightening. It's like this slamming together of two different ways of being. So reading your book, you kind of take us on that back and forth journey as well.
Yeah, God, it's tactile is, it's a big deal. I talk about what it's like, my favorite expression in French, it's in blacksmithing that one becomes a blacksmith. You can't, some things you don't learn out of a book, and the things that are really important, you never learn out of a book. And, put your hand on him if you dare, is what God says about the sea beast and that kind of thing. And the point is, that this connection that we have materially to things is crucial to an account of what they are. And that's what's falling out in the present day. I remember, if you're in the southwest of France and you go and you watch a farmer the head off chicken and then pluck the chicken, your understanding in the middle of that process is really quite different than picking up a pack at Publix or whatever your store is. And I saw an interview once, and they asked the lady, an older woman, she said, I'm a peasant, this is my life. How do you feel about, slaughtering this chicken? And she says, well, I raised the chicken and I love the chicken. And there's a moral imperative here about how to do this properly. And that whole dimension of life is falling out for most of us. The rural poor that hunt deer to put food on the table, the farmers in France that still have weekly shoots to clear birds, but also to put food on the table and that kind of thing. To get into that area is, I think, important for an account of the way God's working. That's why so much of the Old Testament really is, you ask yourself about the sacrificial system, and at one level, these things are not in the realm of rationality. They're more in the realm of reptilian learning. You make a sacrifice because in the doing of it, it's changing you and it's teaching you something in the very activity of following the rules and so forth and so on. And I try to get at this, that in Leviticus, you could have 50 more laws or 25 less. that's not the point. The point is that in being obedient to something, you learn the giver of the law, and you learn who it is you are in relationship to it. And I think that was always for me one of the attractions about the Old Testament, was the fact that it lived close to the material world, and to lose that is something that that I think is a definite cultural worry. And that going to this particular boarding school, the other thing about it too was the joy of being given responsibility and learning how to do things, learning how to sharpen a mattock, how to prevent blisters and that kind of thing. Jesus went off to pray knowing that the disciples were in a boat. Now, this is the King of the universe, through whom all things were made, and the seas and the dry lands and stuff. And what is that all about? In a way, he's trying to teach them the relationship between himself and terror on the seas. That they get to witness this, and those are the things that transform us, that forever change us. That's why when women have babies, they're forever different people. They've gone into some place way out beyond them, and in respect, to watch my wife die, to be there and all that, you're actually going into, and I say this with utmost respect, you're going into the places that we try to hide from. And John Donne is right, that bell is tolling for me too. And it's these categories of existence that I wanted to evoke in this book. They seem to me to be crucial to a full account of who God is, who Jesus Christ is. And at the end of the day, you're hanging a man on a cross, and you are driving nails into him, and his lungs are collapsing. And these are the realities that he has chosen to bear as the sum total of that reality through all time for all people, in order to defeat them. And that's the place where we learn who God is, and we learn what his relationship to us is in terms of eternity, and the own limitations of our lives. And a lot of the sailing stories I tell, one of them in particular that you referred to, where you're at sea, and you realize how really how totally you're with Job. You're in a place that is God's place, that makes absolute and total sense to him, who pulls the tides and lifts the seas and that kind of thing. And you're out there, and you realize how insignificant you are. And that dimension of life is a really important one.
Well, that's a great summation of kind of like the goal for this little volume, of being able to take a reader on a bit of a journey to the Psalter and the book of Job, and which are windows for us as readers into who God is and who we are, right, and the world that he's brought us to. So that's a good way to kind of wrap up our conversation too, because you kind of landed the plane there with just the way in which these kinds of visions of God that we get from the scriptures themselves not only help us understand the Bible, but they shape us as we contemplate them. So I'm very thankful that you've given us just a brief entryway into that with this book, as you reflect yourself on just the grandeur of the scriptures and the God who has testified there. So thanks for also sharing that some of that wisdom with us as well. So I appreciate you coming to chat with us today.
Thank you, Ched. I've enjoyed it, and buy the book. I think it's a really good book. I'm not Donald Trump. He says that all the time. It's a beautiful book. You'll love it.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. That's a good word.
Take care.
Well, I'm glad that you're here with me, here at the end of this episode. If you're still listening, you might be interested in a few ways to support me and the podcast. The first way is what you've already done. Listen to an episode or share it online in some form or fashion. The second way is to rate or review any of my books on Amazon or Goodreads. My latest book is an introduction to biblical theology called One Grand Story: How the Bible Tells Its Story and Why It Matters. Finally, you might also sign up for my newsletter at chedspellman.substack.com. At any rate, Deo Volente, and if the creek don't rise, I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.